At 22,000 feet over Belgium, the cold was a living thing. It came through the waste windows of the flying fortress and found every seam in a man's flight suit. And at 50 degrees below zero, it froze breath to ice on the rubber of an oxygen mask and turned bare metal into something that would take the skin off your fingers if you touched it. The men on the lead bomber had flown in that cold before. What almost none of them had ever done was fly it with a general sitting in the co-pilot's seat. He was a tall, quiet man in a heated suit like everyone else, and from the back of the airplane, you could not have told him apart from any other officer. But the single star was there, and every man on that ship knew whose star it was. Generals did not fly the lead. Generals watched from the ground, from a staff car, from a headquarters hut with a wall map and a telephone. This one had put himself in the most exposed seat, in the most exposed airplane, at the very front of a force of more than 2,000 heavy bombers. And now, better than an hour into the mission, one of the 4 engines on his airplane had begun to run rough. You have to understand what that meant in a bomber formation. The whole defensive system of the 8th Air Force was the formation itself, hundreds of aircraft flying wingtip to wingtip, so their guns overlapped into a wall of fire no fighter wanted to cross. A bomber that could hold formation was hard to kill. A bomber that fell behind was a straggler, and a straggler was a dead man's word. The rough engine cost power, the power loss cost speed, and the lead ship began, very slowly, to slide back through its own formation while the hundreds of bombers behind it flowed on ahead toward Germany. The general in the co-pilot's seat gave an order over the radio. He told the deputy commander to take the lead, and then his airplane was alone, sagging out the front of the greatest air armada ever launched from England, over friendly ground, in perfect visibility, at the exact moment the German fighters arrived. Out of the winter sun they came, and they saw what fighter pilots always looked for first. They saw the cripple. This is the story of the man in that seat, why he was there when he did not have to be, and the choice he made in the 90 seconds that followed. His name was Frederick Walker Castle. To understand why that airplane was over Belgium on the 24th of December, 1944, you have to go back 8 days to the 16th, when the German army did the one thing nobody at Allied headquarters believed it could still do. It attacked. Through the snow and fog of the Ardennes forest, 3 German armies came west in the last great offensive Germany would ever mount, and they punched a bulge into the American line so deep and so fast that the battle took its name from the shape of it. The Battle of the Bulge. Here's the part the Germans had planned most carefully. They picked their week for the weather. Low cloud, fog, freezing rain, a solid gray lid clamped down over Western Europe. And that weather was a weapon, because it grounded the one advantage the Allies had that the Germans could not answer: air power. By the winter of 1944, the American and British air forces owned the sky over Europe. But you cannot bomb what you cannot see, and for a week the fighter bombers sat on their fields, and the heavy bombers stayed in their hangars while American infantry died in the snow at places like Saint-Vith and Bastogne, fighting German tanks with almost no help from above. Then, on the 23rd of December, the sky began to clear. A high-pressure front pushed the cloud back and opened a window, and the Allied air commanders had been waiting for that window with everything they had. What they launched on the 24th was not a raid. It was the largest single air operation the 8th Air Force ever flew. The exact count depends on which record you trust. Roger Freeman, whose mighty 8th War Diary is as close as this campaign comes to an official ledger, and the surviving mission summaries put the number somewhere between 2,034 and 2,046 heavy bombers, escorted by around 853 fighters, sent against more than 65 targets in a single day. The Medal of Honor citation, being careful, simply calls it more than 2,000 heavy bombers. Think about that for a moment. A bomber stream that stretched, by some accounts, more than 300 miles across the sky. And the targets were not factories deep in Germany this time. They were airfields. The whole point of the mission was to reach out and smash the Luftwaffe bases and the road and rail junctions feeding the German offensive, to starve the Bulge from the air the way the ground troops could not starve it on the ground. Danny Parker, in To Win the Winter Sky, his history of the air war over the Ardennes, argues that once the weather broke, the outcome of the whole battle was close to decided, because Allied air power was simply too heavy for the German supply lines to survive in daylight. The men in the bombers on Christmas Eve were flying the mission that helped turn the last German offensive of the war into a slaughter of German trucks and tanks on open roads. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. A few of you have asked for a Medal of Honor story from the Bomber War, and some of you have a personal connection to this one, a father or a grandfather who flew that winter. I want to do it justice. So if your father or grandfather flew with the 487th or the 94th, or worked the flight line at one of those Suffolk fields, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter. Drop them in the comments. Now, back to the morning of Christmas Eve. Before we go into that cockpit, you need to know who Frederick Castle was, because it explains everything about the choice he made at the end. He was not a natural airman, and he was not, for most of the war, a combat flyer at all. He was born in October of 1908 at an army post in the Philippines, the son of a career officer who had graduated from West Point in 1907. Frederick followed him there, graduated in 1930, ranked 7th in a class of 241, and won his wings a year later. And then, like a lot of officers in the starved little peacetime army, he left. He resigned his commission in 1934 and went into business, first with a chemical company and later with the Sperry Gyroscope Company, the firm that built the instruments and the famous bomb sights the Army would later fly to war. There is a small, almost unbelievable detail in his beginning that is worth telling, because it ties this one man to the whole story of American air power. When Frederick was born, his father was a new officer, the first member of the West Point class of 1907 to have a child, which by an old tradition made the boy a kind of godson of the entire class. And one of the young lieutenants who stood as godfather to that infant was named Henry Arnold. The same Henry Arnold, known to everyone as Hap, who would grow up to command the entire Army Air Forces in the Second World War, the man at the very top of the organization, Frederick Castle, would one day die serving. The boy who would become one of the great figures of the Bomber War was, in a sense, carried into the Air Corps from the cradle. That is why, when the war came, Frederick Castle was not a squadron commander. He was a supply and organization man. In the winter of 1942, he was recalled to active duty as a captain and sent to England as one of a tiny handful of officers who went over with Ira Eaker to build the 8th Air Force from nothing. And I mean nothing. Donald Miller, in Masters of the Air, describes what that little group accomplished. Eaker took the 8th from 7 men and no airplanes in February of 1942 to 185,000 men and 4,000 aircraft by the end of 1943. Castle was one of the men who built that machine, the bases, the depots, the supply chains. He was, in the language your audience will recognize from their own careers, a headquarters officer, a staff man, the kind of officer who, in most air forces in most wars, finishes the war with a clean record and a chest full of paperwork and never hears a shot fired. Castle wanted no part of that. In June of 1943, he asked for, and got, command of a combat unit, the 94th Bomb Group, and the group he inherited was in trouble. It had taken hard losses, its morale was low, and it did not trust the staff colonel the brass had sent to fix it. John Frisbee, in a profile he wrote for Air Force magazine that he titled Valor, the Quiet Hero, tells the story of how Castle turned it around, and the detail that matters most is this. He did not fix the group from the ground. He flew. On one of his very first missions with the 94th, under fighter attack, the pilot reported afterward that the new colonel had sat there calmly taking notes on the group's formation flying while the airplane was being shot at. That was the man. He led from the front, he flew the missions, and Frisbee writes that the men of the 94th decided their aloof, bookish commander had both brains and guts. Within weeks, the group was one of the best in the 8th. If that turnaround sounds familiar, it should. It is almost exactly the story Hollywood told a few years after the war in the movie 12 O'Clock High. The hard new commander sent in to fix a broken bomb group by demanding discipline and flying the missions himself. That film was drawn from the real experience of the early 8th Air Force, and Frederick Castle lived a version of it for real, with no camera anywhere near him and no music playing. He proved it again on the 28th of July, 1943, on a deep strike against the aircraft plants at Oschersleben. The weather broke the bomber stream apart on the way in, and much of the force turned back. But Castle pressed on with his own group and a handful of stragglers and put his bombs on the target anyway. By some estimates, the raid cost the Germans close to a month's production of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, and Castle brought his group through without losing a single fortress that day. For pressing on when he had every reason to turn back, he was awarded the Silver Star. Hold on to that phrase, pressing on when he had every reason to turn back, because you are going to see it one more time on the last day of his life. Here's where the stakes start to climb, because this is a man who kept choosing the harder path every time the war offered him an easier one. He led the 94th on the Regensburg mission of August 17th, 1943, one of the most murderous days in the history of the 8th Air Force, when the force sent to Regensburg and Schweinfurt lost 60 bombers out of 376 dispatched, better than 600 men gone in an afternoon, and Castle's group came through it and earned a unit citation. He was promoted to command the 4th Combat Bombardment Wing, several groups at once, a job that entitled him to stop flying combat entirely. He kept flying. In November of 1944, he was promoted to Brigadier General at the age of 36, one of the youngest generals in the whole war. He received a single star from his own staff on the 14th of December, 10 days before the mission we are talking about. And a 1-star general absolutely, positively, did not need to be strapping into a bomber over Germany. He had earned the right never to be shot at again. The plan for the 24th of December put that right to the test. When the air commanders assembled the maximum effort, the 4th Combat Bombardment Wing, Castle's wing, was assigned to lead the 3rd Air Division, and the 3rd Air Division was assigned to lead the entire 8th Air Force. Read that again and let it land. Out of more than 2,000 bombers, one wing would be at the very front, and one airplane in that wing would be at the very front of the front. The lead ship of the whole armada. The most watched, most exposed, most dangerous position in the sky that day. It was the kind of assignment a wing commander would normally hand to a trusted subordinate, a group commander or an operations officer, while he flew in a safer slot or monitored from the ground. Castle assigned it to himself. In my view, that single decision is the hinge of the entire story, and it is worth sitting with before we go any further. He was a general. He was too senior and, frankly, too valuable to be doing this. There is well-founded talk in the sources that his superiors wanted men of his caliber to stop flying combat, because officers like Castle would be needed to build the independent air force everyone knew was coming after the war. He had every institutional reason, every rational reason, to lead this one from a headquarters. He chose the cockpit. And I think you cannot understand what happened over Belgium without first understanding that he put himself there on purpose, knowing exactly what the lead position meant. To see why the lead ship mattered so much, you have to understand how the 8th Air Force actually bombed. The formation your grandfather flew in was called the combat box, a stacked, staggered arrangement of bombers worked out earlier in the war by Curtis LeMay, built to pack the most defensive guns into the tightest space, and inside that box, one airplane did the aiming for everybody. The lead ship carried the best bombardier and the best navigator in the group, and when the lead dropped its bombs, every other airplane dropped on the leader. Hundreds of tons of bombs keyed to one aircraft at the front. That is why the lead was chosen for its equipment and its crew, and it is why the Pathfinder, the radar ship, so often flew the lead, because it could find the aim point through the clouds that covered Germany most of the year. So when Castle put himself in the lead of the wing that led the division that led the whole 8th Air Force, he was not just taking the most dangerous seat for the sake of the danger. He was putting himself where the entire operation would be aimed from. It was the position of maximum responsibility and maximum exposure at the same moment. And flying near him was a deputy lead whose entire job was to take over the instant the lead went down, which tells you something quiet and terrible about how routinely everyone expected the lead ship to be hit. The airplane he chose was a B-17G Flying Fortress, the late model with the chin turret under the nose, assigned to the 836th Bombardment Squadron of the 487th Bomb Group, flying out of the base at Lavenham in Suffolk. She was a special ship, a Pathfinder, which meant she carried a radar set the crews nicknamed Mickey, mounted where the bellyball turret would normally be, so the lead could find and mark the target even through cloud. She carried 3 navigators instead of 1 for exactly that reason, and she had a name that came straight off her serial number. The last 3 figures were 3 fours in a row, and in the pubs around the airfield, 3 of anything in a row was a treble, so the crews called her Treble Four. In the pilot's seat that morning was First Lieutenant Robert Harriman, the aircraft commander, a veteran flying what some accounts say was more than his 50th mission. Castle flew in the co-pilot's seat as the air commander for the whole operation. Around them was a crew of 10 men in total, pilots, navigators, a bombardier, the radar operator, gunners, radio men. For most of them, this was one more mission on a long tally. For Castle, it was his 30th combat mission, and every one of those 30 had been flown by a man who did not have to fly a single one. Picture the briefing that morning. In the dark, before the airplanes were even warm, the crews filed into the hut and sat on the hard benches, and an intelligence officer pulled the cloth off the big wall map. The ribbon of colored yarn ran from Suffolk across the Channel and into Germany, and Castle's own group was headed for an airfield at a place called Babenhausen, one of dozens of German fields on the target list that single day. It was Christmas Eve. A lot of these men had been counting on a stand-down, a day off, maybe a hot meal and a letter from home. Instead, they got the largest mission of the entire war, and a break in the weather nobody was willing to waste. The men who climbed into Treble Four with Castle deserve to be named, because in a story about a general it is easy to forget that he did not go up alone. In the pilot seat was First Lieutenant Robert Harriman. Flying in the tail as an observer was First Lieutenant Claude Rowe, a co-pilot himself. The radar set was run by First Lieutenant Bruno Procopio. The navigators were Captain Edmund Auer and First Lieutenant Henry McCarty. The bombardier was First Lieutenant Paul Beery. The radio was worked by Technical Sergeant Lawrence Swain. The gun positions were held by Staff Sergeant Lowell Hudson and Technical Sergeant Quentin Jeffers. 10 men in total, counting the general, in one cold airplane at the very tip of the spear. The group began taking off from Lavenham a little after 9 in the morning, at 0900 hours, climbing up through what the records describe almost cruelly as perfect weather. They assembled the formation at 7,000 feet, that delicate, dangerous ballet of hundreds of heavy bombers finding their places in the sky, and then began the long climb toward the bombing altitude of 22,000 feet. And right there, at the very start, the first thing went wrong. Assembling a force that size is like choreographing a city, and this one fell about 15 minutes behind schedule as the bombers sorted themselves out. 15 minutes does not sound like much. In the geometry of an air battle, it was everything, because it broke the timing with the fighters. The escort for the day was the long-range fighter that had won the Daylight Air War, the P-51 Mustang, hundreds of them, and by this point in the war, they were largely the bubble canopy P-51D model, the airplane that could go all the way to the target and back. The bombers and the fighters were supposed to meet at a precise point at a precise time, but the fighters were late lifting off, delayed by weather at their own bases, and the bomber stream was running behind, and the rendezvous that was supposed to wrap the lead in a protective screen of Mustangs simply did not happen on time. The front of the greatest bomber force ever assembled pushed on toward the German border with its escort not yet in place. If you could have stood in an English field that morning and looked up, you would have seen something no one had ever quite seen before and no one would ever quite see again. Bombers by the 100, then by the 1,000, climbing and circling and forming up, contrails scratching the whole sky white, the drone of it rolling across the countryside for an hour on end. More than 2,000 heavy bombers is not a formation you can take in with a single glance. It is a river of aircraft that takes the better part of a morning just to pass one point on the ground. Somewhere near the head of that river was one flying fortress with a radar dome where its belly turret should have been, and a general in the co-pilot's seat, and everything strung out behind it. Every one of those thousands of airplanes and tens of thousands of men was arranged in an order that began with him. For the men inside those airplanes, the first hour of a mission was its own kind of ordeal, long before any enemy appeared. As the formation climbed past 10,000 feet, the crews went onto oxygen. And oxygen discipline was life and death, because a man whose line froze or slipped could pass out and be gone within minutes without anyone noticing. The cold came next, deepening with every 1,000 feet, until at bombing altitude the inside of the airplane was colder than a deep freeze, and a bare hand laid on metal would freeze fast to it. The gunners watched their weapons for the frost that could jam them at the worst possible moment, and somewhere in that long climb, the men on the lead ship would have searched the sky above and around them for the little friends, the Mustangs that were supposed to be there by now, and would have felt the particular unease of not finding them. Every bomber crewman alive knew that the escort was the whole difference between a hard day and a massacre. On the morning of the 24th, at the very front of the formation, the escort was not yet there. And then the engine. On the climb, one of Treble Four's 4 engines began to give trouble, running rough, losing power. Here is where the whole thing starts to unravel, and it unravels in the most ordinary way imaginable. Not a dramatic explosion, just one tired engine on one airplane, and the slow physical fact that an airplane down on power cannot hold its place at the head of a formation that is climbing and pressing ahead at full cruise. Treble Four began to sink back. Castle, doing exactly what a lead commander is supposed to do, radioed the deputy to take over the lead so the mission would not be disrupted, and let his crippled ship fall away from the front of the formation. Now think about the map, because this is the cruelest detail of the day. All of this was happening while the bombers were still over Allied-held ground, over Belgium, over the very American First Army troops the mission was flying to protect. Treble Four was not deep in Germany surrounded by enemy territory. She was over friendly soil and clear air, falling out of formation, and directly below her were American soldiers. The German fighters found her almost at once. In an unusual and aggressive move, the Luftwaffe had pushed its fighters forward that day, west toward the Liege area, to hit the bombers before the American escorts could get into position. Among them was a German fighter wing, Jägerschwader III, led by Heinz Bahr, one of the highest scoring aces in the entire Luftwaffe. These were not green pilots. They were experts, and they saw a lead ship, a Pathfinder, falling behind its formation with no little friends anywhere near it. To a fighter pilot, that is not a target. That is a gift. The attack came in the way the German pilots had learned worked best, from the front and slightly high, where the fortress was weakest, and where a closing fighter could be through the guns and gone in a heartbeat. Cannon shells walked across the airplane. There was no formation around Treble Four to throw up a defensive screen, no wall of overlapping 50 caliber fire from 100 neighboring bombers, because she'd already fallen out of that wall. She was one lone fortress, and her own 10 machine guns against a wing of veteran fighters, and the outcome of that arithmetic was never really in doubt. The only question left open was how many of the 10 men aboard would get out before the end. What Castle did next is the reason we are talking about him. The obvious move, the move any manual would endorse, was to salvo the bombs. Drop the whole heavy load at once. It would have lightened the airplane, given back speed and maneuverability, maybe enough to claw back to the formation, or at least to fight on more even terms. It is the standard survival response for a crippled bomber. Castle refused. He would not jettison his bombs because below him were American troops, and a full bomb load dropped from a fortress does not care whose helmet it lands on. He chose to keep the bombs, and the weight and the sluggishness that came with them, rather than risk killing the men on the ground he had come to defend. I want to be plain about what that decision cost him. In refusing to drop the bombs, he gave up his best chance to save his own airplane and his own life. He made that trade in the space of a few seconds, under fire, and he made it in favor of strangers on the ground he would never see. So the lagging, unescorted fortress became the target, and the German fighters worked her over. The Medal of Honor citation, the official one, describes what happened next in language that is very precise and very restrained. The enemy fighters ripped the left wing with cannon shells. They set the oxygen system on fire. They wounded 2 members of the crew. Repeated attacks started fires in 2 of the engines, and a B-17 with 2 engines burning as an airplane, living on borrowed seconds, because the wings are full of fuel and the fire is walking toward it. This is the part the documentaries skip, so let me slow down and be exact about it. With the airplane burning and the situation hopeless, the bailout order was given. And a bailout from a crippled bomber is not a clean thing. Men have to disconnect from oxygen and heat, find parachutes, crawl to hatches, and go out into a 50 below slipstream with the airplane possibly spinning, all in a matter of seconds. To give the crew that time, somebody has to hold the airplane steady. Somebody has to stay on the controls and keep the diving, burning fortress flat and level enough for men to reach the hatches and jump, instead of letting it roll into a spin that would pin everyone inside by centrifugal force and carry them all down. The Medal of Honor citation says that Frederick Castle gallantly remained alone at the controls to give every other crew member the chance to escape. And I want to be honest with you about the record here, because you deserve the real history and not a polished legend. The exact final seconds are not perfectly documented, and the sources do not entirely agree. The citation says he remained alone at the controls. John Frisbee's account has Castle taking the controls to buy the pilot time to find his parachute. Some of the crash investigators' notes and Belgian eyewitness accounts, compiled years later, suggest both pilots may still have been aboard, with Lieutenant Harriman unable to find his chute when the airplane went in. What every version agrees on is the thing that matters. Somebody held that airplane steady while the crew got out, and Castle was one of the men who stayed to do it. They got out. Belgian villagers on the ground below watched the burning fortress make a slow turn, trailing heavy smoke, and they counted the parachutes as they blossomed. Then the right-wing fuel tank exploded. The airplane lost the wing at around 12,000 feet, snapped into a violent spin, and the forward fuselage, the part with the cockpit, came down inverted near a chateau in the province of Liège, and the bomb load that Frederick Castle had refused to drop on his own countrymen detonated when it hit the ground. Of the 10 men aboard Treble Four, 5 came down under their parachutes and lived. 5 did not. Castle was one of the 5 who did not. He was 36 years old, and he had been a general for 34 days. 4 other men died with him. Lieutenant Harriman, the pilot. Lieutenant Rowe, the observer in the tail. Sergeant Swain at the radio. And Lieutenant Procopio, the radar man, who got clear of the airplane but was too badly hurt and died of his wounds. The other 5, Auer, McCarty, Beery, Hudson, and Jeffers, came down alive in the Belgian fields and were gathered up by American troops and local people, some of them the very soldiers the mission had flown out to protect. The wreckage of Treble Four fell scattered across several miles of the Liège countryside. The main piece with the cockpit down near a chateau, other pieces in and around the nearby villages. In the years after the war, the Belgians of that area did not forget what they had watched come out of their sky on Christmas Eve. In the village of Freicher, they raised a stone monument to the American airmen who fell there, and it names the whole crew, not just the general. That is worth holding on to, because the people on the ground understood something the record sometimes blurs. 10 men were in that airplane, and its commander spent his last minutes making sure as many of them as possible would walk away from it. The Medal of Honor came later, approved after the war was over, and it was Ira Eaker himself, the man who had first brought Castle to England, who presented it to Castle's mother at the family home in New Jersey. There is a hard symmetry in that. Eaker had recruited the Sperry executive into uniform in 1942 and handed him the tools to help build an air force. A few years on, he handed that man's mother the highest award the country can give, because her son had used those years to become the kind of commander who dies in the lead ship. And here is the hard thing about a machine that large. It did not stop for him. The deputy lead took over exactly as the whole system was designed for him to do. The wing pressed on, the division pressed on, and the 487th went in and bombed its target while its own commander was falling out of the sky behind it. That is not coldness. It is the nature of an operation of that size. And Castle, of all people, understood it, because he had helped build the machine that worked that way. He had spent his war turning the 8th Air Force into something that could absorb the loss of any single man, even the man at the very front, and keep flying. On Christmas Eve, it proved that it could, at his own expense. 2,000 airplanes finished the job that day. One of them did not come home, and the star was in it. Let me give you the numbers, because with this audience, the numbers are the argument. The mission Castle died leading, mission number 760, put somewhere between 2,034 and 2,046 heavy bombers over Europe on a single day, with about 853 fighters escorting them, against more than 65 separate targets. Of those bombers, roughly 1,884 actually reached and struck their objectives. And here is the statistic that tells you how completely the air war had turned by that point. For all its size, the whole operation lost only about 12 bombers and 10 fighters. On the day the 8th Air Force flew its largest mission of the war, it lost less than 1% of its force. The doctrine had been paid for in the blood of 1943. But by Christmas Eve of 1944, the American Air Arm could put 2,000 bombers over Germany and bring almost all of them home. It is worth saying what all those bombers actually did, because Castle did not die for a gesture. The force that morning struck airfield after airfield across western Germany, fields with names like Babenhausen and Biblis, and the complex around Darmstadt and Frankfurt, along with the rail yards and road junctions and communication centers that were feeding men and fuel into the Ardennes. The bombing was not perfect, it never was, but it was overwhelming, and it helped slam the door on the Luftwaffe's ability to support the German offensive from the air. Castle's own group, the 487th, was among the hardest hit in those opening minutes, losing several aircraft besides Treble Four, some of them forced down in Belgium rather than lost outright. The lead paid the steepest price of the day, which is precisely what the lead was for. To feel the full weight of that morning, you have to remember what the week before it had been like on the ground. While the sky stayed shut, the German offensive rolled forward through the snow, and the American troops caught in front of it. The men freezing in the foxholes around Bastogne and along the shoulders of the Bulge were fighting tanks with what they could carry and dying for want of the air support that could not reach them. The frustration reached all the way to the top. General George Patton, whose Third Army was driving north to relieve the encircled town of Bastogne, was so desperate for a break in the weather that he had a chaplain of the Third Army write a formal prayer for clear skies, and then had it printed and handed out to his soldiers. When the weather finally broke on the 23rd, and the bombers came out in force on the 24th, more than a few men on the ground looked up at that endless river of fortresses and felt, for the first time in a week, that they were not alone. Frederick Castle was at the head of the answer to Patton's prayer. Castle's own airplane was one of that small number that did not come home. 5 men out of 10 survived the loss of Treble Four. He himself was flying his 30th combat mission, and it is worth remembering that the count of 30 is remarkable, not because it is high. Plenty of enlisted crewmen flew a full tour of missions, but because the man flying them wore a general's star and had no obligation to fly any of them. For the medal itself, the numbers are just as stark. Frederick Castle was one of 15 men of the 8th Air Force to be awarded the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. He was the senior man among them and the only general. In fact, in the entire United States Army Air Forces across the whole war, only 2 generals received the Medal of Honor. The other was Brigadier General Kenneth Walker, lost over the harbor at Rabaul in the Pacific in 1943. Both were brigadier generals, so I would steer you away from calling Castle the highest ranking, because it invites an argument with the record. The clean, true statement is this. He was one of only 2 Army Air Forces generals to receive the Medal of Honor in the Second World War, and he was the only general of the 8th Air Force to die leading a mission. That is a superlative that will survive contact with your comment section. It helps to understand what that medal actually meant in the Bomber War. The Medal of Honor is not given for doing a hard job well, or even for extraordinary courage in the ordinary sense, and the daylight bombing campaign was full of extraordinary courage that went unrecorded. It is given for gallantry above and beyond, at the risk of life, and in the strategic air war that almost always came down to a single documented act of self-sacrifice, witnessed by men who lived to describe it. That is the thread running through most of the bomber medals of the whole war. A pilot who held a dying airplane level so his crew could jump, a man who stayed at a burning station so the others could reach the hatch. Castle's medal is of exactly that kind. It was not awarded for winning a battle or leading a campaign or turning a group around, though he did all of those things. It was awarded for the last 90 seconds, for the decision to spend his own life buying time for the men around him. The entire weight of it rests on that one choice made under fire by a man who could just as easily have made the other one. Now let me turn to the harder question, the one this channel exists to ask. Who decided and what, if anything, went wrong? Because a man died here, and the honest thing is to look at whether he had to. Start with the escort. The lead ship was caught alone and unescorted at the worst possible moment, and the reason was a 15-minute delay in assembly stacked on top of fighters that lifted off late because of weather at their fields. It would be easy, and it would be cheap, to turn that into a villain, to say somebody failed Castle and got him killed. I do not think the record supports that, and I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of story where it is tempting to invent a scapegoat. The truth is more ordinary and, in a way, sadder. 2,000 bombers and 800 fighters are a machine of almost unimaginable complexity, and on a maximum effort thrown together in a hurry to exploit a break in the weather, small frictions, a late takeoff, a slow assembly, an engine that picks the wrong morning to run rough, compound into a gap in the timing. The Germans, for once flying aggressively and forward, found that gap. That is not a conspiracy. That is war working the way war actually works. And I think dressing it up as somebody's crime would be a disservice to the people who planned a genuinely successful mission. The harder accountability question is not about the escort. It is about Castle himself, and it points inward at his own choice. Should a brigadier general have been flying the lead of the entire 8th Air Force at all, by every rule of sound military economy, the answer is no. He was too senior, too experienced, and too hard to replace to be risked in the single most dangerous seat in the sky. The Army had spent years and enormous resources turning a Sperry executive into one of the finest combat leaders in the bomber force, and on Christmas Eve it lost that entire investment to a burning wing over Belgium. If you are running an Air Force as a system, the loss of Frederick Castle was an expensive, arguably avoidable waste of an irreplaceable officer. There were people in the command who felt that way, who thought men like him had no business flying combat anymore. It is worth pausing on why anyone would have wanted him grounded, because it was not timidity. By the winter of 1944, the men running American air power were already looking past the war toward the fight they had wanted for 20 years, an Air Force independent of the Army, equal to it, its own service with its own uniform and its own seat at the table. Building that new institution would take exactly the kind of officer Castle had become, a combat leader with a general star and a headquarters man's grasp of how the entire machine fit together. Officers like that were the seed corn of the post-war Air Force. Henry Arnold ran his commanders hard and spent them without much sentiment. But even Arnold's headquarters understood that a brigadier general with that rare combination of gifts was worth more alive in 1950 than dead over Belgium in 1944. There was a real argument made by serious people that Castle owed it to the future to stop flying. He heard that argument. He flew anyway. And I think you have to sit honestly with the fact that the case for grounding him was not cowardice and it was not bureaucracy. On its own terms, it was correct. He simply valued something else more, and it killed him. And here is where I have to be honest, that the system's logic and the man's honor point in opposite directions, and I do not think you can resolve it cleanly. The rational institutional answer is that Castle should have been on the ground. The human answer, the one his crews would have given, is that a commander who flew the ugliest missions himself, who took notes under fire on his first day and put himself in the lead ship on his last, was worth more to the morale of the bomber force than any staff officer he might have become. Both of those are true. I've gone back and forth on it, and I think the most honest verdict is that Frederick Castle made a choice that was wrong by the cold arithmetic of the war and right by everything else, and that the two things simply do not cancel out. You are left holding both. Let me put in the operational detail, because this is where this audience lives and where the difference between a real story and a generic one shows up. The airplane was a B-17G, not an F, the late war fortress with the powered chin turret that finally gave the bomber some defense against the head on attacks the German fighters favored. The Germans had learned to come at the fortress from straight ahead because the early models were nearly blind in that direction, with no gun that could answer a fighter boring in from 12 o'clock high. The G model's chin turret was the Army's answer to that lesson. 2 more heavy machine guns hung under the nose to cover the one angle that had been slaughtering bomber crews. It was hard-won knowledge, written in the losses of 1943, and there is a bitter irony in the fact that on Christmas Eve of 1944 it did Castle no good at all. His airplane was not lost because it was poorly armed. It was lost because it was alone. No number of guns on one bomber can hold off a wing of fighters that has all the time in the world to work. And that, in the end, is the whole tactical lesson buried inside his death. The Flying Fortress was never designed to fight by itself. The moment it left the formation, the ending was already written. As a Pathfinder, she carried the radar the crews called Mickey in place of the ball turret, which is why she was chosen to lead, because she could find the target through cloud. The 487th Bomb Group marked its tails with a white letter P inside a square, and the group's fortresses wore yellow on the tail and wingtips for recognition. On her fuselage, she carried the national insignia as it looked in the winter of 1944, the white star in a blue circle with a white bar to each side and a blue border around the whole thing. If you ever see this scene rendered with a red border on that star, somebody has made an error of more than a year, because the red border was gone by the late summer of 1943. And the Mustangs that should have been overhead were, by this date, mostly the bubble canopy P-51D, the definitive version of the airplane that took the 8th all the way to Berlin and back. The men who shot Castle down deserve to be named accurately too, because getting the enemy right is part of getting the story right. They were not scraped together, boys. Jagdgeschwader 3, the wing that hit the lead that day, was led by Heinz Spar, a fighter pilot with more than 200 victories, one of the deadliest men ever to fly a Messerschmitt. When Treble Four fell out of formation, she fell in front of some of the best fighter pilots left in the German Air Force at the one moment in the entire mission when no Mustang could reach her. Everything about the geometry of those few minutes was as bad as it could possibly have been, and Frederick Castle spent those minutes not trying to save himself, but trying to keep his airplane flat so 9 other men could jump. There is a grim footnote to who those German pilots were and why they happened to be there. The Luftwaffe fighter force that rose on Christmas Eve was, by this point, being carefully gathered for one last great blow. Just a week later, on the first day of 1945, the Germans would throw hundreds of fighters against Allied airfields in a surprise attack they called Operation Bodenplatte, the last mass effort the German fighter arm would ever make in the West. The pilots who caught Castle over Belgium came from that dwindling pool of experienced men pushed forward aggressively into the Ardennes because the German command understood this was its final chance to matter. They spent themselves against the bomber streams in the last days of December and again on New Year's Day. And after that, the Luftwaffe as a fighting force was essentially finished. The men who killed Frederick Castle were not the future of the German Air Force. They were the last of its past, burning through the little time it had left. Here is my honest assessment of what this story means, and it is not the simple one. It would be easy to file Frederick Castle under heroism and move on, and he was heroic, there is no doubt about that. But I think the deeper thing this mission reveals is a truth about leadership that your audience already knows in its bones, because most of you have lived some version of it in uniform or in a company or on a shop floor. There are 2 kinds of people who end up in charge. There's the kind who understands that rank is a reason to be somewhere safer, and there's the kind who understands that rank is a reason to be somewhere harder. If you have ever watched a boss send other people into the difficult place while he managed the situation from a comfortable distance, then you already understand exactly how rare and how costly the opposite instinct is. Castle had climbed all the way to a general's star, the point at which the whole institution was telling him to stop taking risks, and he answered by putting himself in the most dangerous seat in the sky over Germany. That is not the normal shape of a career. In my experience, it is close to the opposite of it. There's one more thing I want to say about how this story fits the larger argument we make on this channel, because in one important way, it cuts against the grain of it. Most of the time, the pattern in the American Air War is the gap between the men who decided and the men who paid. The theorists at a desk in England or Washington, sending crews to die for an idea they never had to test in the air themselves. Frederick Castle started on the wrong side of that gap. He was a desk man, a supply officer, exactly the kind of headquarters figure this channel usually holds to account. And then he did the one thing the theorists almost never did. He climbed into the airplane. He went and found out for himself, over and over, what he was asking of the crews, until the finding out cost him everything. John Frisbee titled his profile of Castle the Quiet Hero, and I have come to think the quiet part is the whole key to the man. He did not write a doctrine or fight a public feud or leave a shelf of speeches behind him. He led from the front and said very little about it, and when the one moment came that tested whether he meant any of it, he answered with his hands on the yoke of a burning airplane. That is a rarer kind of man than the ones we usually put in front of you here, and he deserves to be understood as the exception that measures the cost of the rule. And yet, for all of that, most Americans today could not tell you his name. Ask people to name a hero of the air war, and you will hear about the aces, the men with the painted kill markings and the high scores, and those men earned their fame honestly. But Frederick Castle never fit the shape of that legend. He shot down no swarm of enemy fighters. He had no famous airplane with a long row of victory marks stenciled under the canopy. He was a middle-aged general who had once been a businessman, who quietly fixed a broken bomb group and then kept flying until a routine engine failure on the largest mission of the war left him alone in front of the guns. There is no easy movie in that. There's only a man doing his duty long past the point where duty asked anything more of him, and I think that is exactly why his story is worth the time it takes to tell it properly. The famous names take care of themselves. It is the quiet ones who slip out of memory and who most need somebody to say their names out loud. And I think that is why the story lasted, why they named an airfield after him, why the men who flew with him remembered him the way they did. It was not just the medal. It was that a headquarters man, a supply officer, a business executive in a general's uniform, kept choosing the cockpit over the desk right up until the cockpit killed him. There is a version of Frederick Castle who spent the war building depots, made Major General, helped stand up the new Air Force after 1947, and retired with a fine record and a long life. He chose a different version. I'm not going to tell you it was the wiser choice, because I do not believe it was. I will tell you it was a rarer and a braver one, and that the difference between those two words is the whole story. What the mission revealed, in the end, was how far the air war had come, and what it had cost to get there. On Christmas Eve of 1944, the 8th Air Force could darken the sky over Germany with more than 2,000 bombers and lose almost none of them, a thing that would have been unimaginable in the bloody autumn of 1943. The doctrine that got so many men dead in the early years had finally been made to work, paid for by the long-range fighter and by the crews who did not live to see it pay off. And in the lead ship of that triumphant, overwhelming force flew a general who did not have to be there, who refused to drop his bombs on his own soldiers, and who stayed at the controls of a burning airplane so that 5 other men would see Christmas. They buried him at the American cemetery at Henri-Chapelle in Belgium, not far from where he came down. 2 years later, they took an Army airfield in California and gave it his name, and for nearly 50 years, until it closed, aircraft took off and landed at Castle Field in the name of a quiet man who led from the front until the front took him. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.